My mother doesn't want you here. My husband said it so quietly that no one around us noticed. Then he looked me straight in the eyes and delivered the sentence that would end our 22-year marriage. You're an embarrassment. For a moment, I honestly wondered if I'd misheard him. The late afternoon sun reflected off the white marble entrance of the Dallas Country Club, where my sister-in-law Lauren's wedding was about to begin. Guests in designer dresses and tailored tuxedos flowed past us, laughing as a string quartet played Zoser inside. I wasn't standing in front of the ballroom because I was late. I was standing there because security wouldn't let me enter. My name isn't on the guest list, ma'am. The young security guard had apologized. There must be some mistake. I smiled politely. I'm sure there is. I had expected Ethan to fix everything with one sentence. Instead, he became the mistake. My mother doesn't want you there, he repeated, adjusting the cufflinks I'd bought him for our 20th anniversary. Why? His jaw tightened. She thinks you'll make people uncomfortable. I've barely spoken to anyone in months. That's not the point. Then what is? He sighed as though I were the difficult one. Victoria, you're an embarrassment. The words landed harder than any scream ever could. Not because they were loud, because they were calm, calculated, final. I stared at the man I'd loved since I was 23 years old. The man whose first business proposal I'd rewritten overnight, because he was too nervous to present it. The man whose father I'd quietly helped refinance, after the family nearly lost everything during the recession. The man whose entire family believed he was their hero. He couldn't even look me in the eye anymore. Behind him, I saw my mother-in-law Eleanor greeting guests beneath an enormous arch of white roses. She looked radiant, proud, happy. Why wouldn't she? Just 3 days earlier, I'd bought her dream house, an $8.8 million waterfront mansion in Naples, Florida. She thought Ethan had paid for it. Everyone did. No one knew the money had come from me. I never corrected them. That had always been my mistake. I see, I finally said. Ethan looked relieved. I knew you'd understand. No, I understood something entirely different. I pulled out my phone. He watched me carefully. What are you doing? Replying. I opened our text conversation and typed one word. Understood. I pressed send. Then I looked up and smiled. I hope Lauren has a beautiful wedding. Without waiting for another word, I turned around and walked toward the parking lot. I didn't cry, not yet. The valet brought my black Mercedes around within minutes. As I settled into the driver's seat, I finally allowed myself one long breath. 22 years gone, not because of another woman, not because of money, not because we'd stopped loving each other, because somewhere along the way, my husband had stopped respecting me. Those are two very different things. Love survives arguments, respect survives silence. Once respect dies, everything else eventually follows. I started the engine but didn't drive away. Instead, I sat there watching guests arrive. Families posing for photographs, grandparents hugging grandchildren, little girls carrying flower baskets. It looked like every perfect American wedding I'd ever attended. Except today, I wasn't family. At least that's what Eleanor wanted everyone to believe. The irony almost made me laugh. Because if anyone there truly knew how much of that wedding had been paid for by me, the entire evening would stop. The flowers, the orchestra, the imported champagne, even Lauren's honeymoon villa in Tuscany. Every invoice had quietly crossed my desk months ago. Eleanor had thanked Ethan repeatedly for his generosity. He accepted every compliment. He never corrected her. At first, I thought he was simply avoiding awkward conversations. Over time, avoidance became habit. Habit became expectation. Expectation became entitlement, and entitlement eventually becomes cruelty. My phone buzzed. It was my executive assistant, Megan. Mrs. Bennett, hi Megan. You sound different, I probably do. Everything okay? I looked back toward the ballroom. No. She stayed quiet. One reason Megan had worked beside me for 15 years was because she knew when silence mattered more than questions. Finally, she asked softly, "What do you need?" I smiled. Exactly the right question. Not, "What happened?" Not, "Are you okay?" Simply, "What do you need?" "I need the number for Daniel." She didn't hesitate. "I'll text it now." Within seconds, my phone vibrated again. Daniel Brooks, senior partner, Brooks and Ellison Estate Attorneys, the man who had spent nearly 2 decades helping structure my businesses, trusts, charitable foundations, and asset protection plans. The man who understood one important fact. Almost everything the Bennett family enjoyed legally depended on me. Not Ethan, not Eleanor. Me. I looked at the number for nearly a minute. Then I locked my phone again. No, not yet. Anger makes expensive decisions. I had built my career by never acting while emotional. If I was going to change the course of my life, I would do it calmly, methodically, professionally. Exactly the way I'd built my fortune. I drove aimlessly through Dallas. Past Highland Park. Past the office tower where my investment company occupied the top 3 floors. Past restaurants where Ethan and I used to celebrate anniversaries. And our every street carried memories. Every memory suddenly felt borrowed. At a red light, I remembered something my grandmother used to say. People rarely show you who they are during hard times. They show you during easy ones. Life had become too comfortable for Ethan. He'd forgotten who made that comfort possible. Maybe I'd helped him forget. The light turned green. I kept driving. 48 minutes had passed since I left the country club, then 53, then 58. I finally pulled into an empty overlook beside White Rock Lake. The water reflected the orange glow of sunset. Beautiful, peaceful. Nothing like the storm quietly building inside me. My phone read exactly 1 hour since I had texted Ethan. Understood. I unlocked the screen, scrolled to Daniel Brooks, pressed call. He answered before the second ring. Victoria, it's me. I thought you'd be at the wedding. I was. A pause. That doesn't sound good. It isn't. His voice became instantly professional. What would you like me to do? I looked across the lake. For the first time all afternoon, I smiled. Daniel, I think it's time we review every financial arrangement connected to the Bennett family. There was complete silence. Then he quietly replied, I'll meet you at the office within 30 minutes. I ended the call. The sun dipped below the horizon. Some endings arrive with fireworks. Mine arrived with one calm sentence and one phone call. The Bennett family had no idea that while they were raising champagne glasses inside the ballroom, the foundation beneath everything they believed they owned had just begun to shift. Daniel was already waiting when I arrived. It was nearly 8 in the evening, yet every light on the 26th floor of my headquarters remained on. My executive team had no idea why I had called an emergency meeting with my attorney after business hours. They only knew that if I requested privacy, I usually had a very good reason. Daniel stood as I entered the conference room. He had been my attorney for almost 19 years. More importantly, he had become one of the few people who knew the complete truth about my marriage. He studied my face for several seconds before speaking. What happened? My husband called me an embarrassment. Daniel slowly removed his glasses. I'm sorry, so am I. Was that all? I laughed softly. No. I placed my phone on the conference table and slid it toward him. He read Ethan's final text. My mother doesn't want you there. You're an embarrassment. Daniel looked back at me. After everything you've done for them? I know. He remained silent. There wasn't much left to say. Sometimes facts speak louder than outrage. 22 years earlier, I had met Ethan Bennett at a commercial real estate conference in Houston. He was charming, confident, funny. He came from what everyone believed was one of Dallas's most respected old money families. I, on the other hand, was the daughter of 2 factory workers who had died within months of each other when I was 16. After bouncing between relatives and foster care, I put myself through college on scholarships, part-time jobs, and sheer stubbornness. By 30, I had built a small but growing investment company, specializing in distressed commercial properties. I wasn't glamorous. I simply worked harder than almost everyone else. Ethan admired that. At least I believed he did. We married 3 years later. During our honeymoon, I learned my first secret about the Bennett family. They weren't wealthy. They only looked wealthy. Their country club memberships, luxury cars, vacation homes, private schools. Everything depended on refinancing old debt with new debt. They had perfected the appearance of success. Behind closed doors, the numbers were terrifying. One evening, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his head buried in his hands. My father borrowed against everything. How bad is it? Worse than anyone knows. Does your mother know? She refuses to believe it. He looked completely defeated. I don't know how to save them. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. We'll figure it out. Back then, I still believed we meant exactly that together. SUBTHANANDMYOFAND. Within 6 months, I quietly arranged financing through one of my investment partnerships. The Bennett family's manufacturing company survived. No one outside the boardroom ever knew why. Ethan thanked me over dinner. "You saved my family. We saved them." He smiled. "I couldn't have done it without you." I believed him. At the time, he believed it too. The years passed. My company expanded into Texas, Arizona, Florida, and Colorado, then California, then Tennessee. Every acquisition strengthened our portfolio. Every successful deal generated more income than the last. Eventually, money stopped being something I chased. It became something I managed. That was around the time Eleanor's expectations began to change. At first, she only asked for little favors. "Victoria, would you mind helping Lauren with her student loans?" "Of course." "Ethan mentioned you understand investments. Could you look over this property?" "Absolutely." "My friend is opening a restaurant." "No problem." Every request sounded temporary, reasonable. Family helping family. Then the requests became larger: private school tuition, vacation homes, medical treatments, luxury cruises, investment capital, designer renovations. Every Christmas brought another expensive surprise someone expected Ethan to provide. Every Christmas, I quietly paid the bill. One afternoon, Eleanor hugged Ethan after he handed her the keys to a new Mercedes. "My son always takes care of his mother." I stood 3 feet away. She never looked at me. Ethan smiled awkwardly. He said nothing. Driving home, I asked him gently, "Why didn't you tell her?" He kept his eyes on the road. "It makes her happy." "It isn't true." "I know." "Then why?" He sighed. "You know how Mom is." I did. She loved appearances, status recognition, being admired. Correcting her in public would have embarrassed her, so I let it go again and again and again. Looking back, every silence taught her another dangerous lesson. She learned she could erase me, and I'd allow it. Daniel opened one of the folders he'd brought. "You've personally funded 38 major purchases for the Bennett family." I stopped counting. I didn't. He slid several pages toward me. There they were: property acquisitions, trust contributions, private loans, business guarantees, medical expenses, tuition payments, charitable donations made in Eleanor's name. Nearly every milestone the Bennett family celebrated over the past 2 decades had one thing in common: my signature, not Ethan's, mine. Daniel looked at me carefully. "Do you remember what I asked you when we structured these agreements?" I nodded. "You asked if I was protecting myself." "And what did you say?" "I said I trusted my husband. And I told you trust and documentation should never replace each other." He wasn't criticizing me, he was reminding me. Everything had been documented. Every transfer, every guarantee, every legal obligation. The Bennett family simply never bothered reading the paperwork. They assumed Ethan handled everything. Ironically, Ethan assumed I always would. I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Dallas. The city lights shimmered beneath the summer sky. Beautiful, busy, unaware that my entire life had changed in a single afternoon. "I keep asking myself one question," I admitted. Daniel waited. "When did he stop seeing me?" He thought for a long moment. I don't think he stopped seeing you." I turned toward him. "I think he stopped noticing the cost of everything you quietly carried." That sentence stayed with me. People often appreciate miracles until miracles become routine. Then they call them expectations. My phone vibrated. "Ethan. Incoming call." I stared at the screen. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I let it go to voicemail. Seconds later, another call, then another, then Lauren, then Eleanor. I didn't answer any of them. Finally, a text arrived from Ethan. "Where are you?" "Mom says the Naples closing has been delayed. The title company won't release the property. They say there's a problem with the funding. Can you call me?" I read it twice. Interesting. The legal review hadn't even begun. Daniel noticed my expression. "What is it?" I handed him my phone. He smiled for the first time that evening. "They're already feeling the first ripple." I looked down at the growing list of missed calls. For 22 years, whenever the Bennett family did something, they called me. Not because they loved me, because I solved problems. Tonight would be different. Tonight, for the very first time, their problems would have to wait. I slept for exactly 3 hours, not because I was anxious, Because my mind had already made its decision. When you've spent your entire adult life making multi-million-dollar business decisions, you learn something important. The emotion belongs at home. Facts belong at the conference table. At 6:30 the next morning, I walked into my office carrying a cup of black coffee. Dallas was just waking up. My executive assistant Megan looked up from her desk. "You've got a full schedule today." "I know." She hesitated. "And your husband has called 17 times. I figured. He also came by around 6 this morning." I stopped walking. "He came here? He wanted to see you. What did you tell him?" "Exactly what you once told me to say." She smiled politely. "Mrs. Bennett isn't available without an appointment." I couldn't help smiling. "Thank you. I assumed you had your reasons." "I do." At 8 sharp, Daniel entered the boardroom carrying 4 thick binders. Behind him came 2 senior attorneys. Then my chief financial officer, Robert, finally, my trust administrator, Melissa. Every person sitting around that table had signed confidentiality agreements years ago. They knew the truth about my financial structure. None of them had ever met Ethan socially. That had been intentional. I wanted my business and my marriage to remain separate. Ironically, that separation was about to save me. Daniel opened the meeting. "Victoria has requested a complete legal review of every active financial arrangement benefiting the Bennett family." No one looked surprised. Professional people don't react with emotion. They react with questions. Robert adjusted his glasses. "Are we discussing suspension or termination?" "Review first," I answered. "Then action where appropriate." Melissa opened a spreadsheet. "There are 37 active obligations. Walk me through them." She nodded. "The Naples property scheduled to close tomorrow. $8.8 million. Correct. Currently sits inside a revocable family trust awaiting final authorization." Daniel looked toward me. "That authorization requires your signature." "I haven't signed." "No," Robert continued. "There are also 4 personal guarantees attached to Ethan's investment company." "Any legal obligation requiring me to continue?" He scanned several pages. "No." "What happens if they're withdrawn?" "The banks will request replacement collateral within 30 days, and if none exists, the loans become immediately callable." I leaned back quietly. Interesting. I hadn't realized Ethan had become that financially exposed. Not because I'd never cared, because I'd never imagined I'd need to know. Daniel folded his hands. "Victoria." "Yes, I need to ask something directly." I nodded. "Are you trying to punish your husband?" The room became silent. Everyone waited. I thought carefully before answering. "No." "Then what are you trying to accomplish?" "The truth." No one spoke. Finally, I continued. "For 22 years, I've allowed everyone, including Ethan, to believe a version of reality that simply isn't true." Robert nodded slowly. "I understand. I won't destroy anyone, I know. But I also won't continue financing people who publicly humiliate me." Daniel smiled slightly. "That's a very different objective." "It is." At exactly 9:42 a.m., Daniel drafted the first letter. It wasn't dramatic. No lawsuits, no threats, simply a formal notice. "Pending review. Funding for the Naples property is temporarily suspended until further written authorization by the grantor." The grantor? Me. A second letter followed. The title company, a third. The escrow officer, a fourth. The estate planning bank. Everything happened according to contracts. Everyone had signed years earlier. Nothing illegal, nothing emotional, just paperwork. Funny how paperwork changes lives. ... Meanwhile, about 40 miles away, the Bennett family had gathered for a farewell brunch following Lauren's wedding. I didn't need to imagine it. Later, I would hear every detail. Lauren was opening gifts when Eleanor's phone rang. She answered cheerfully. Then her smile disappeared. "What do you mean the closing has been suspended?" Across the room, Ethan reportedly looked up. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Another 30 seconds passed. Then Eleanor's voice became louder. "No, that's impossible." Guests turned to stare. "The money is already there." Silence. Then, "What authorization?" She ended the call abruptly. "Ethan." "What?" "They're refusing to release the house." He frowned. "What are you talking about?" "They say the funding hasn't been approved." He reportedly laughed. "There has to be a mistake." "There isn't. My wife handled everything." "Exactly." I had at 10:15 my phone rang again. "Ethan." This time I answered. His relief was immediate. "Victoria, finally." Good morning. Something crazy is happening, so I've heard. The Naples closing has stopped. I know. They're saying they need your authorization. That's correct. Long silence. What do you mean? I mean exactly what they told you. I don't understand. I don't think you ever tried to. His breathing changed. Victoria, are you angry about yesterday? I looked out the window. What do you think? I'm sorry if I didn't mean you told me I was an embarrassment. I was upset. No, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. His voice softened. My mother was emotional. So you agreed with her? I was trying to keep the peace. I almost laughed. Whose peace? Another silence. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. Can you just call them and fix this? There it was. Not how are you, not are you okay, not can we talk? Simply fix it. I closed my eyes. Ethan. Yeah, do you know whose money bought that house? Mine. No. Silence. My company transferred the funds. He didn't respond. I personally established the trust. Nothing. I personally guaranteed the purchase. Still nothing. Finally. You're joking. I've never joked about business. He sounded genuinely confused. But everyone said I know. You never corrected us. No. Why? Because I believed protecting my husband's pride mattered. His breathing became heavier. You mean everything Eleanor thanked you for? I stopped. He finished the sentence himself. God was you. God, yes. Neither of us spoke for almost a minute. 22 years of assumptions were collapsing inside his mind. Finally, he whispered, I didn't know. I believe you. Victoria, but not knowing stopped being an excuse yesterday. Around noon, Megan knocked gently. There's someone downstairs, Ethan. She nodded. He refuses to leave. I looked at Daniel. What do you recommend? He smiled. As your attorney? Yes. Don't avoid him forever. And as my friend? Make him wait. I smiled. For how long? He glanced at his watch. Long enough to understand what you've been waiting 22 years to receive? What? Respect. I stood and walked toward the elevator. Not to meet Ethan. Not yet. First, there was one more document waiting for my signature. The final suspension of every discretionary financial benefit connected to the Bennett family. I picked up the pen, signed my name, placed it back on the table. Outside my office window, the Dallas skyline looked exactly the same. Inside, everything had changed. By the time I finally agreed to see Ethan, he had been sitting in the reception area of my office for nearly 3 hours. Megan walked into my office and asked quietly, Are you ready? I looked at the clock. It was almost 4 in the afternoon. Yes. She nodded and returned a few minutes later. Ethan's here. I took a slow breath before stepping into the private conference room. He was standing beside the window with both hands in his pockets. He looked exhausted. His tie was loose. His eyes were bloodshot. For the first time in years, he didn't look like the confident Bennett everyone admired. He looked like a man who had just discovered his life wasn't what he thought it was. When he turned toward me, I barely recognized him. You look tired, I said. I didn't sleep. I did. He gave a weak smile. I guess one of us had to. Neither of us sat immediately. Finally he spoke. I need you to explain what's happening. I already did. No. He shook his head. I mean everything. I studied him for several seconds. Then I pulled out the chair across from him. Sit. Daniel entered carrying 3 thick binders. Ethan frowned. What are those? My records. Daniel placed them neatly on the table. Mrs. Bennett asked me to prepare a complete financial history involving your family. Ethan looked confused. Why? Because yesterday you told her she wasn't family. The room became silent. Daniel opened the first binder. Let's start with 2008. Fadi. He slid a document across the table. Your father's manufacturing company. Ethan glanced at it casually. Then his expression changed. This loan was funded through Victoria's investment partnership. I thought First National Bank. They only serviced the loan. Daniel pointed to another page. The capital came from her. Ethan slowly looked at me. You never told me. You never asked. But the second binder opened. 2011, the lake house renovation. The contractor invoices, the architectural fees, the landscaping. Paid entirely by Victoria. Ethan rubbed his foot. I thought I know what you thought. Another page. 2013, Lauren's graduate school tuition. Another. 2015, your mother's heart surgery. Another. 2017, your father's tax settlement. Another. 2019, the Aspen vacation property. Another. 2021, the Family Charitable Foundation. Another. 2024, the Naples Mansion. Every page carried one familiar signature, mine. No dramatic music, no yelling, no accusations, just 22 years of facts, one receipt after another, one canceled check after another, one wire confirmation after another. Eventually, Ethan stopped turning the pages. He simply stared at them, almost whispering. He asked, "Did my mother know?" "No." "My father?" "No." "Lauren?" "No." "Who knew?" "My attorneys, my accountants, my board, and you." He looked up. I honestly believed I know. Just then Daniel's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. "It's Eleanor." Neither of us spoke. He looked toward me. "Should I answer?" I nodded. "Put her on speaker." He accepted the call. "Daniel Brooks." Her voice exploded through the room. "Where's Victoria?" "I'm here." There was a brief silence, then she spoke directly to me. "What are you doing?" "Reviewing my finances." "You've embarrassed this family." I almost smiled at the irony. "Really? You stopped the closing?" "Yes. My furniture is already there." "I know. The movers are waiting." "I know. My neighbors are expecting us." "I understand. You need to fix this immediately." "No." Silence. The kind that arrives when someone hears the word no for the first time. Finally, she asked, "What do you mean no?" "I mean the purchase has been suspended. You promised me that house." "I never promised you anything." "Ethan did." I glanced toward my husband. He lowered his head. "You paid for it. I considered it a gift. And you made it very clear yesterday that I'm an embarrassment." Her voice hardened. "This has nothing to do with yesterday." "It has everything to do with yesterday. You can't punish us over hurt feelings." "I agree." She sounded relieved. "So you'll restore the funding?" "No." Another long silence. "I'm protecting my dignity." Without waiting for her response, I nodded to Daniel. He ended the call. Ethan buried his face in his hands. "I can't believe this." "What part?" "My mother." "Or yourself?" He looked at me both. For nearly a minute, neither of us spoke. Then he asked something I hadn't expected. "Were you ever going to tell me the truth?" He nodded. "I planned to." "When?" "The day you were proud of me instead of what I could quietly provide." His shoulders slumped. "I failed you." "You did." I kept thinking I was protecting everyone. No. You were protecting appearances. That evening, the family group chat exploded. Lauren demanded answers. Her husband wanted to know whether the Naples house was actually owned. Eleanor insisted there had been a banking mistake. Then my father-in-law Richard, who had always spoken the least, finally wrote one sentence. "Victoria, is any of this true?" I stared at the message. Richard had never treated me badly. Quiet, reserved, sometimes emotionally distant, but never cruel. I replied with a single photograph, one page from the original trust agreement. It showed my name, the funding source, the purchase amount, nothing more. 5 minutes later, Richard called. I answered. His voice sounded older than I remembered. "Victoria?" "Yes." "I spent 20 years believing my son rescued this family." "I know. I'm ashamed." "You don't need to apologize for believing what you were told." "No." He sighed deeply. "I need to apologize because I never bothered asking." That sentence hit me harder than I expected. Not because it erased the past, because it acknowledged it. For the first time, someone inside that family wasn't defending themselves. They were accepting responsibility. The following morning, several Dallas business publications began reporting that the purchase of an $8 million Naples waterfront estate had been unexpectedly delayed. No names were released, only speculation. Inside my office, however, everyone already knew the truth. Not because I announced it, because reality has a way of revealing itself once people stop pretending. Late that afternoon, Daniel returned carrying one final folder. Everything has now been formally suspended. The discretionary trusts, the guarantees, the luxury property funding, the annual family distributions. He placed the folder in front of me. Nothing has been taken from them. He paused. They simply no longer have access to what was never actually theirs. I signed the final acknowledgement, closed the folder, and for the first time in 22 years, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not victory, not revenge, relief. Because carrying people who don't appreciate you is exhausting, and the moment you finally set the weight down, you realize how heavy it really was. The headlines disappeared within 2 days. The delayed mansion closing never became a public scandal. No television cameras showed up outside my office. No reporters camped in front of my house. Real wealth rarely creates loud drama. It creates quiet consequences. Those consequences began arriving one by one. A week after the wedding, Ethan called again. This time I answered immediately. "Hello, can we meet?" His voice sounded different. Gone was the confidence that had once made every conversation feel like a negotiation. Now he simply sounded tired. "I'll meet you." "When?" "Tomorrow morning." "Where?" "Our favorite coffee shop." I thought about it. The little cafe in Highland Park had been part of our marriage since the beginning. We had celebrated my first commercial property purchase there. We had toasted when his father recovered from surgery. We had planned vacations over cinnamon rolls and black coffee. It felt strangely appropriate. 9. I'll be there. The next morning, Ethan was already waiting when I arrived. He stood as I walked in. For a second, instinct almost made me hug him. 22 years of habits don't disappear overnight. Instead, I shook his hand. His eyes briefly filled with sadness. "I deserve that." "Yes." We ordered coffee. Neither of us touched it. Finally, he spoke. "I've spent the last week reading everything." "What everything?" "The financial records, the trust agreements, the partnership documents, the guarantees." He looked down. "I had no idea." "I believe you." "No." He shook his head. "I mean, I had absolutely no idea how much you've done." I didn't answer. "There wasn't anything left to add," he continued. "My father spent 2 days going through old files and he cried." That surprised me. Richard Bennett wasn't an emotional man. I've seen him cry twice in my entire life. Ethan said quietly. The first time was when his brother died, and the second when he realized he'd spent 20 years thanking the wrong person. Huh. Ethan reached into his briefcase. "I brought something." He slid a leather folder across the table. Inside was every credit card connected to family trusts, every access card, every account authorization, every signature stamp. "I don't want any of it." "You don't have to give it back." "I'm not giving it back." He looked directly at me. "I'm admitting it never belonged to me." For a long moment, I simply stared at him. This wasn't the Ethan I'd seen outside Lauren's wedding. This was the young man I'd married. Honest, humbled, afraid. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. I should have said those words years ago. 2 days later, Richard asked if he could visit my office. When he arrived, he looked noticeably older than I remembered. He carried a small wooden box. I found these while cleaning my desk. Inside were dozens of handwritten thank you notes. Every birthday card I'd ever sent him. Christmas letters, family photographs. I never realized something. "What?" He smiled sadly. In every picture, he handed me one from Lauren's college graduation. I stood in the back row holding everyone's coats, making sure everyone had water, checking reservations on my phone, looking after everyone else, never once standing in the center. "But you were always taking care of us." I was happy to. "No." He shook his head gently. "You convinced yourself you had to earn your place." His words struck a nerve I hadn't expected. Maybe he was right. Growing up without parents had taught me one dangerous lesson. If I wanted to be loved, I had to be useful. Somewhere along the way, usefulness had quietly replaced self-worth. 3 weeks later, I officially filed for divorce. The courthouse felt surprisingly ordinary. No dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no accusations, just signatures, paperwork, legal language. The judge looked over our agreement. "Mrs. Bennett, are these terms acceptable to you?" "They are." "Mr. Bennett?" "Yes, Your Honor." The divorce itself took less than 20 minutes. Walking back to the parking lot, Ethan stopped me. "I know this won't change anything." "It won't. I still need to say it." I waited. "I'm sorry." "For what?" He looked toward the courthouse behind us. "For confusing your generosity with obligation. For letting my mother define our marriage. For believing respect could wait until tomorrow." His voice cracked. I lost the best thing that ever happened to me. I felt tears forming. Not because I wanted him back, because I knew he finally understood. Sometimes understanding arrives too late. Life kept moving. Without my financial support, the Bennett family had to make difficult decisions. Nothing catastrophic happened. No one became homeless. No one lost health care. No one went bankrupt. But the lifestyle changed. The Naples mansion was never purchased. The Aspen vacation property was sold. Luxury memberships were canceled. The chauffeur was dismissed. Private jets became commercial flights. Designer shopping trips became carefully planned budgets. For the first time in decades, the family began living on what they actually earned. Ironically, they discovered it was enough. Perhaps not enough for appearances, but enough for life. So, then came the biggest surprise of all. About 4 months after the divorce, I received a handwritten letter. Not an email, not a text, an actual letter. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor. I almost threw it away. Instead, I opened it. It began simply, "Victoria, for most of my life I confused being admired with being respected." I kept reading. She admitted she had enjoyed telling friends that her son had become so successful. She admitted she liked the attention, the compliments, the envy. She admitted something else. I convinced myself that if people knew the truth, they would think less of my family. Then came the sentence that made me stop breathing for a moment. "The truth is, I thought less of you because admitting what you'd done made me feel ashamed of what I hadn't." I read it again and again. Finally, the last paragraph. "I'm not asking you for another dollar. I'm asking if someday you'll allow me to apologize in person." I folded the letter carefully, set it inside my desk drawer. Some apologies arrive because people need something. Others arrive because people have finally become someone different. I wasn't sure which one this was, but for the first time, I was willing to find out. Almost a year passed before I saw Eleanor again. By then, my life looked nothing like it had before Lauren's wedding. The divorce had long been finalized. I had moved into a smaller home overlooking White Rock Lake. Friends had asked why I didn't keep the enormous estate Ethan and I once shared. My answer was always the same. I don't need a bigger house. What I needed was a lighter life. For the first time in decades, my calendar wasn't filled with obligations that belonged to other people. No emergency wire transfers, no family crises, no last-minute rescues, no pretending someone else deserved the credit. Instead, I rediscovered mornings, coffee on the patio, long walks around the lake, dinner with friends who knew me simply as Victoria, not as someone's wife or someone's financial safety net. Peace turned out to be far more valuable than luxury. My company continued growing. Ironically, stepping away from the emotional weight I'd carried for 22 years made me a better leader. I created a scholarship program for young adults aging out of foster care. Whenever people asked why that cause mattered so much to me, I smiled. Because someone believed in me before I knew how to believe in myself. The first class included 12 students. The following year, 28. By the third year, our foundation had expanded into 3 states. Watching those young people graduate, find careers, and build stable lives gave me a kind of joy no business acquisition ever had. Success felt different when it wasn't measured by balance sheets. It felt human. One afternoon, my assistant walked into my office. "There's a gentleman here asking to see you." "Who is it?" "Ethan." I looked toward the window. "I'll see him." He entered carrying nothing but a plain envelope. No expensive watch, no designer suit, no appearance of someone trying to impress anyone. He looked comfortable, healthier, older, wiser. "Hi, Victoria." "Hi." We sat across from each other. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Finally, he smiled. "I got a job," I heard. He had accepted a position as chief operating officer for a regional manufacturing company. A normal executive salary, long hours, real accountability, no trust funds, no shortcuts. "I'm proud of you," he laughed softly. "That means more than you know." He looked around my office. "I almost didn't come. Why did you? I owed you something. You've already apologized." "I wasn't here to apologize." He slid the envelope across the table. Inside was a check. It wasn't large, not compared to the money I'd spent over the years. Attached was a handwritten note, "First repayment." I looked up. "Ethan, I know I'll never repay everything. I wasn't expecting you to. I'm not doing it because I owe the money." He smiled. "I'm doing it because I owe the effort." That sentence nearly brought tears to my eyes. For the first time since I'd met him, he fully understood the difference between receiving and earning. "I'll accept it." "You will?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because refusing it would rob you of the chance to become the man you're trying to be." He nodded quietly. "I hoped you'd say that." Before leaving, he stopped at the door. "I loved you, Victoria, I know. I think I spent too many years loving what you gave instead of appreciating who you were." I smiled gently. "I know that too." He walked away. I watched him disappear down the hallway. Oddly enough, I didn't feel sadness. I felt gratitude. Some relationships aren't meant to last forever. Some are meant to teach us exactly what we need before they end. 3 months later, Eleanor requested to meet. We chose a quiet cafe, far from the country club where everything had fallen apart. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. She still dressed elegantly, but something had changed. The confidence that once demanded attention had been replaced by quiet humility. She sat down slowly. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure I would. I wouldn't have blamed you." She folded her hands. For almost a full minute, she searched for the right words. Finally, they came. I've replayed that day outside Lauren's wedding hundreds of times. I remained silent. I wanted everyone to admire my family. She smiled sadly. And in chasing admiration, I lost the respect of the one person who deserved mine the most. She reached into her purse and placed something on the table. The house key I'd given her, after closing on a much smaller home several months earlier. "I don't want gifts anymore." I looked at the key. "You don't have to return it, I know." She pushed it closer anyway. "I need to." Tears filled her eyes. "I treated generosity like an obligation. I measured your worth by what people thought of you. And I forgot the simplest truth." She looked directly at me. "The strongest people are usually the quietest ones." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I reached across the table and gently covered her hand with mine. "I forgive you." She closed her eyes, not dramatically, just with relief. "I'm not asking to become family again, I know. I only hoped I wouldn't spend the rest of my life wondering if you'd hate me forever. I don't. Hate is heavy. I've carried enough weight already." She laughed through her tears. "So have I." We left the cafe separately, not as mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, not as enemies, simply as two women who had finally learned that pride costs far more than honesty ever will. People often ask me if I regret paying for that mansion. The answer surprises them. No. Because the money didn't expose who I was. Losing the mansion exposed who everyone else was, including me. I learned that generosity without boundaries eventually becomes permission for disrespect. I learned that silence can protect peace for a little while, but it often sacrifices truth. Most importantly, I learned that forgiveness isn't pretending the past never happened. Forgiveness is choosing not to let the past keep deciding your future. If there's one thing I hope you take away from my story, it's this. Never confuse love with self-sacrifice. The people who truly love you won't ask you to disappear so they can shine. They'll make sure the world knows exactly who stood beside them. And if someone only values you for what you provide, they're not protecting your heart. They're spending it. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story reminded you of someone, or if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this encourage you to believe that kindness and dignity are never weaknesses, I hope you'll subscribe and join me for the next one. Weiss. Until then, take care of your heart. It's worth far more than any mansion. I accidentally found my late husband's old bank account. There was $33 million in it. But my husband always said we were poor, and his salary was $500 a month. When I called the bank, the manager answered with 3 words. "Good day, dear listeners. It's Anna again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled." People always say that grief changes you. What they never tell you is that sometimes grief opens a door you never knew existed, and behind that door is a room full of lies. My name is Carol Whitmore. I'm 53 years old. I live in a modest 2-bedroom house in Columbus, Ohio. And for 26 years, I was married to a man I thought I knew completely. His name was Richard. He died 14 months ago from a heart attack. Sudden, quiet, unremarkable. The way he lived, the way I always believed we both lived. We were not wealthy. That was the foundation of our life together. The thing I accepted early and never questioned. Richard worked as a mid-level logistics coordinator for a regional trucking company. His salary, he told me, was around $500 a month when we first married, rising slowly over the years to somewhere around $200 by the time he retired at 61. We clipped coupons, we vacationed at state parks. We drove used cars. When the washing machine broke in 2019, we argued for 3 days about whether to repair it or replace it, and we repaired it, because replacement felt like an extravagance we couldn't afford. I taught part-time at a community college, English composition, 2 or 3 courses a semester. My income was modest but steady. Between the two of us, we got by. We were comfortable in that particular American way that looks like contentment from the outside, but feels, if you're honest, like a careful permanent restraint. Richard was a quiet man, not cold. He laughed at his own jokes. He brought me coffee on Saturday mornings without being asked. He remembered my mother's birthday when I forgot. But he kept things close. I thought it was his nature. I thought it was what made him calm, reliable, steady. I never thought it was what made him a liar. He had a sister, Patricia. Patricia Whitmore Hayes, 58, married to a man named Doug Hayes, who sold commercial real estate in Scottsdale, Arizona. Patricia and Richard were close in a way that always made me feel slightly outside something I couldn't name. They called each other every Sunday. They had private jokes I was never included in. When Richard died, Patricia arrived before the ambulance had even left our street. She stood in my kitchen, opened my refrigerator without asking, and made herself a cup of tea. I told myself she was grieving. I told myself I was being uncharitable. The paperwork after Richard's death was manageable. He had a will, modest, unsurprising, the house to me, a small life insurance payout, $45,000, which covered the funeral and a portion of what we owed on the HVAC system, his 401k, which contained $18,000. That was it. That was the estate of Richard Allen Whitmore, as I understood it. I spent several months moving through the administrative fog of widowhood, canceling accounts, notifying Social Security, sorting through his belongings, which I did slowly, reluctantly, in the way you do when every object still smells like the person you lost. It was in October, 14 months after his death, that I found the envelope. I was clearing out the top shelf of his home office closet, a task I'd been avoiding since the beginning, because that shelf held the things he cared about most. His father's watch, a folder of old photographs, the deed to the house. I was looking for the deed, actually, because I was refinancing. My hand went to the back of the shelf, past a shoebox I assumed contained receipts, and touched something that slid. A manila envelope, unsealed, tucked flat against the wall. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a bank statement, issued by First Meridian Private Bank, Chicago, Illinois. The account holder was listed as R.A. Whitmore. The statement was dated March 2021, 18 months before his death. The balance on that statement was $33,241,780.4. I sat down on the closet floor. I sat there for a long time. The afternoon light shifted. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked. I read the number again, and one more time after that. $33,241,780, 780. My husband, who argued with me about a washing machine, had $33 million in a private bank account in Chicago. I don't know how long it took me to stand up and walk to the kitchen. I know I poured myself a glass of water and didn't drink it. I know I sat at the kitchen table for another hour. And then, because I am the kind of woman who, when confronted with something impossible, reaches for a practical action, I picked up my phone and called the number printed on the statement. The phone rang twice. A man answered, composed, professional, measured. First Meridian Private Bank. This is Gerald Bloom. I told him my name. I told him my husband's name. I told him I had found a statement and I needed to understand what I was looking at. There was a brief pause. Not the pause of surprise, the pause of a man choosing his words carefully. Then Gerald Bloom said exactly 3 words. He left instructions. I felt the floor shift beneath my feet. He left instructions. I must have said something after that, asked something. Responded somehow, because the call lasted another 4 minutes. But I have no memory of those 4 minutes. What I remember is hanging up and standing in my kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, holding a phone that had just rearranged everything I thought I knew about my own life. Gerald Bloom had been carefully uninformative. He'd confirmed the account existed. He'd confirmed Richard was the account holder. He told me that in order to discuss the specifics of the account and any associated documents, I would need to come in person to the Chicago branch with proof of identity, Richard's death certificate, and documentation of my status as his surviving spouse. He'd been polite, he'd been precise, and he had said absolutely nothing about what those instructions were. Who else might be aware of them? Or why my husband had spent 26 years telling me we were struggling to make ends meet while quietly sitting on a fortune. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed, Richard, and I had shared for 2 decades, and I stared at the ceiling, and I did what grief had temporarily suspended, but couldn't stop forever. I thought about the washing machine. I thought about the vacations we hadn't taken because we couldn't afford them. I thought about my mother's surgery in 2017 when she needed a hip replacement and didn't have adequate insurance. And I had called Richard from the hospital parking lot and cried and said I didn't know how we were going to help her. And he had held my hand that night and said, "We'll figure something out, Carol. We always do." And we had scraped together $4,000 from our joint savings to cover the gap, and it had felt enormous, and he had let it feel enormous. And all that time, $33 million. I got up at 4 a.m. and went to the kitchen and made coffee and opened a legal pad and started writing. Not a plan yet, just a list. Everything I remembered that now looked different in this new light. The Sunday phone calls with Patricia. The way she always seemed to know things about Richard's mood, his thinking, his decisions before I did. The Christmas 2 years before his death, when she gave us a check for $1,000 as a gift, and I had been moved and grateful, and Richard had accepted it with a strange flatness, like a man enduring something rather than receiving something. The way Doug Hayes, her husband, always deflected when the subject of money came up, changed the subject with a particular skill of a man who'd been told to. Did Patricia know? I wrote that question at the top of the page and circled it 3 times. By 6 a.m., I had 2 pages of notes and a weight in my chest that sat somewhere between grief and fury. The grief was old. It'd been there since Richard died, and it didn't leave now, but the fury was new, and it was clean, and in a strange way, it was useful. It had edges. It pointed somewhere. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. I was a 53-year-old part-time English instructor who had spent her adult life managing a modest household. I didn't have a lawyer on retainer. I didn't have wealthy friends with connections. I had a legal pad, a bank statement I'd found in a shoebox, and the words of a private bank manager ringing in my ears. He left instructions. What instructions? To whom? Beneficiaries? Patricia? Doug? Some arrangement that had been carefully constructed to exclude me, his wife, his legal next of kin. I knew enough to know I knew very little, and I knew enough to know that if I moved carelessly, I could lose everything. The first decision I made that morning was the most important one. I would not tell anyone what I'd found. Not my sister Karen in Pittsburgh, not my neighbor Donna, who is kind and well-meaning, and constitutionally unable to keep a secret. And certainly not Patricia Hayes, who called me every other Wednesday to ask how I was managing in a voice that now sounded in retrospect like a woman keeping tabs on a situation. The second decision, I would get a lawyer, not a general family attorney, an estate attorney. Someone who specialized in exactly this, contested estates, hidden assets, post-death financial discovery. Someone who would not be impressed by a private bank's polished composure and would know what questions to ask. The third decision was harder, and I sat with it for a long time at my kitchen table as the Columbus morning came gray and quiet through the window. The third decision was this. I would go to Chicago. I would walk into First Meridian Private Bank. I would sit across from Gerald Bloom, and I would find out what my husband's instructions were. But I would not go unprepared, and I would not go alone. I opened my laptop. I searched. Estate attorney, Columbus, Ohio. Hidden assets, deceased spouse. I wrote down 3 names from 2 different websites that mentioned probate litigation specifically. Then I closed the laptop, showered, dressed in the most composed thing I owned, a charcoal blazer I wore to faculty meetings, and drove to the public library, because I didn't want to make these calls from my home phone. The woman who walked into that library was someone I didn't quite recognize yet. She was frightened. She was exhausted. She had spent the night dismantling 26 years of her own memory. But she had a plan. The attorney's name was Margaret O'Shea. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building on East Broad Street in Columbus, and it was the kind of office that communicated seriousness without theater. Law books, a clean desk, 2 chairs that were comfortable without being luxurious. She was 51, Ghanaian American, with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses she took off and set down before she spoke, which I would come to understand meant she was about to say something that required your full attention. I sat across from her on a Thursday morning and laid everything on the table. The bank statement, my notes, the timeline of Richard's death and estate, the 3 words Gerald Bloom had said. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she put her glasses back on, looked at the statement once more, and then looked at me. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, you were right not to tell anyone. And you were right to come here before you go to Chicago. She explained my situation with a clarity that was paradoxically both calming and alarming. Under Ohio law, as Richard's surviving spouse, I was entitled to an elective share of his estate, meaning that even if his will had attempted to exclude me, I had legal rights. The key question was whether this account had been structured in a way that placed it outside the probate estate. A trust, a beneficiary designation, a business entity. Private banks sometimes helped wealthy clients structure assets in ways that were legal, but designed to minimize a spouse's access. The phrase, he left instructions, Margaret said, setting her glasses down again, tells me this account was almost certainly accompanied by some kind of directive. A letter of instruction to the bank, a named beneficiary, possibly a revocable living trust. We need to know which. She filed a formal legal request that same afternoon, a spousal rights inquiry, accompanied by Richard's death certificate and our marriage certificate, directed to First Meridian Private Bank's legal department in Chicago. She also filed a request with the Cook County Probate Court for a full asset disclosure order. These were not aggressive moves, she told me. They were procedural. They were the kind of moves that put a bank on notice that a surviving spouse knew her rights. It also, Margaret said with a careful neutrality, alarms anyone who might have an interest in that account that you are aware of its existence. That was the moment I understood fully what I was setting in motion. I drove home from Margaret's office and found 2 missed calls on my landline. Both from Patricia. I didn't call back. I sat in the kitchen and watched my phone and waited for it to ring again. And when it did, I let it go to voicemail. Patricia's voice was warm and practiced. Carol, hi, it's me, just thinking about you. Wanted to check in. Call me when you get a chance, okay? Doug sends his love. She had never mentioned Doug sending his love in 14 months of Wednesday calls. I wrote that down. The following Tuesday, I drove to Chicago. I'd booked a single night in a mid-range hotel near the Loop, told no one where I was going, and left a note for my neighbor Donna, saying I'd be visiting a college friend. I brought every document Margaret had told me to bring, plus copies of everything organized in 2 separate folders in case one was lost. First Meridian Private occupied the ground floor of a glass building on North Michigan Avenue. It was exactly what you'd expect from an institution that managed the money of people who didn't discuss money. Quiet, expensive, deliberately calm. A receptionist led me to a conference room. Gerald Bloom arrived 4 minutes later. He was in his mid-60s, silver-haired, with the particular composure of a man who had sat across from difficult conversations for 40 years, and had learned to show nothing. He shook my hand. He offered water. He sat down. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, I want to be straightforward with you. Now that your attorney has been in contact with us, we've been expecting this meeting. He placed a document folder on the table between us. The account, he explained, had been established in 2003, 4 years into our marriage. It was held under a revocable living trust titled the Roth Family Trust. Richard was the settlor. The trust named 2 beneficiaries upon his death, Patricia Whitmore Hayes for 60% and Douglas Hayes for 40%. I was not mentioned anywhere in the document, but here was the critical detail, the thing that changed everything. The thing that made Gerald Bloom's composure slip for just a fraction of a second when he placed the second document in front of me. Under a 2018 amendment to the trust, Richard had added a single handwritten addendum. It was dated March 14, 2018, 2 weeks after my mother's hip surgery. 2 weeks after I had cried in a hospital parking lot while my husband held $33 million in a private account in Chicago. The addendum read in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. In the event my wife Carol becomes aware of this trust, full disclosure is to be made to her, and she is to be provided with independent legal counsel at the trust's expense. I believe she will know what to do. I stared at that paper for a very long time. He had known. Somewhere. Somehow in 2018 he'd written a door into the wall he'd built around me. I didn't know yet whether that made things better or worse. I didn't know yet whether it was guilt or love, or some complicated mixture of both. What I knew was this: I had my first direct evidence, and Patricia Hayes had no idea I just read it. Margaret moved quickly after Chicago. The 2018 addendum was, in her words, an extraordinary piece of evidence, because it demonstrated that Richard himself had anticipated this moment and had explicitly provided for my involvement, if it didn't override the trust's beneficiary designations automatically. But it created grounds for a full probate challenge, combined with the spousal's elective share provisions under Ohio law, and a strong argument that the trust had been established using marital assets accumulated during our 26-year marriage. We had a case. We filed in Cook County Probate Court on a Wednesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Patricia Hayes was calling my cell phone. I let it ring. By Friday, she was calling my landline. I let that ring too. On Saturday, Doug Hayes called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered that one because I hadn't recognized it and hadn't thought for one careless moment to check. Carol. His voice was the same as always. Large, confident, the voice of a man who sold things for a living. We need to talk. Doug, I said, you should speak with my attorney. Your attorney? He said the words the way you say something that offends you. Carol, we're family. Richard would be heartbroken by this. You're dragging his memory through a court system over a private financial arrangement he made years ago. Speak with my attorney, I said again, and I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment after I hung up. My hands were not shaking. I noticed that specifically my hands were not shaking, and I filed it away as information about myself that I hadn't known before. They arrived at my house on a Tuesday evening, both of them. Patricia in a cream-colored coat I'd seen her wear at Richard's funeral. Doug in a sport coat, both of them standing on my front porch, with the careful positioning of people who'd rehearsed this. I opened the door but did not invite them in. We're not here to fight, Patricia said. Her voice was soft, grieving, expertly calibrated. Carol, we loved Richard, we want to honor what he built. But this account, this trust, was his private decision. He had his reasons. Going to court is going to cost everyone. It's going to take years. It's going to be terrible for everyone who loved him. What you're doing, Doug said, his voice dropping, is going to expose things Richard specifically didn't want exposed. Things about where that money came from. Things that could affect you too, Carol. Your reputation, your name. I looked at him steadily. Are you suggesting that my husband's money was obtained illegally? Doug blinked. The rehearsed version of this conversation had not included that question. I'm saying, he said more carefully, that some of Richard's business arrangements were complex, private. Going through a court process means those things become public record. Then I suppose they become public record, I said. Margaret O'Shea, my attorney. You have her number. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a long moment after I heard them walk back down the porch steps. Doug's voice carried. He was saying something sharp and low to Patricia, something that wasn't meant for me, but reached me anyway, through the door. She's not going to back down. We have to call Ferris. Ferris, a name I'd never heard. I wrote it down the moment I reached the kitchen. I called Margaret the next morning and told her everything. The phone calls, the visit, Doug's implication about the money's origins, the name Ferris. She was quiet for a moment, then said, the threat about the money's origins is a bluff. If the money had been obtained illegally, they wouldn't want a court process either. They want you scared. They want you to walk away and take nothing. She told me she'd investigate the name Ferris through the trust's financial records once we had full disclosure access. Carol, she said before we hung up, you did exactly the right thing. You stayed calm, you gave them nothing, and you came to me immediately. I thanked her. I hung up, And then I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I drove 30 minutes to a state park east of Columbus, parked the car, and walked along a trail for 2 hours in the October cold. No phone, no legal pads, no statements. The trees were turning, reds and golds, and a particular fierce orange that Richard had always called the angry color. I teased him about that phrase every October for 26 years. I let myself be sad for a while. Not about the money, about him. About the man I'd loved, and the man I apparently hadn't fully known, and the way those two things existed in me simultaneously without canceling each other out. Then I drove home, made soup, and slept for 9 hours. When I woke up, I was ready again. The offer came by certified mail 10 days after my walk in the park. It was a formal letter from a law firm I'd never heard of, Harksissel and Ferris, LLC, based in Scottsdale, Arizona. That was the Ferris. Not a person Doug had been calling. And a partner in the legal firm that, it turned out, had drafted the Raw Family Trust in the first place and had been managing its administrative affairs for 2 decades. The letter was polite, almost courtly, in the way that letters written by attorneys threatening you sometimes are. It acknowledged my spousal claim. It acknowledged the 2018 addendum. And it offered me, in full and final settlement of all claims, the sum of $750,000. $750,000 from a $33 million account. I read the letter twice at my kitchen table. Then I photographed it and emailed it to Margaret. And then I did a thing I surprised myself by doing. I laughed. Not bitterly, almost with relief. Because $750,000 was, let me be precise about this, exactly 27% of what was in that account. It was an offer designed not to be accepted. It was an offer designed to see what kind of woman I was. I was the kind of woman who called her attorney and said, "Decline, and make sure they understand, we'll see them in court." Margaret filed our formal rejection the following morning. What happened in the weeks that followed was a particular kind of silence that I had come to recognize. Patricia stopped calling. Doug stopped calling. The certified letters stopped. The front porch remained empty on Tuesday evenings. They were watching, calculating, conferring with Hardcastle and Ferris. I was in a phase of the process that Margaret called the waiting room. Both sides in position, the machinery of the court in motion, nothing left to do but hold steady. I found to my own surprise that I needed people. I am not, by nature, someone who reaches easily for others. Richard's death had made me more solitary in some ways. I'd retreated into routine, into work, into the particular quiet of a house where someone used to be. But this situation was too large to carry alone, and I needed the weight distributed. I called my sister Karen. Karen is 4 years younger than me, lives in Pittsburgh, and works as a high school guidance counselor. She's practical and loving and completely without drama, which is precisely what I needed. I drove to Pittsburgh on a Friday evening and sat in her kitchen. A kitchen nothing like mine, cluttered and warm and smelling of the garlic she puts in everything. And I told her everything. She listened the way Margaret listened, completely, without interrupting. When I finished, she poured us both another cup of coffee, and she said, "That man, Carol, that man." She said it 3 times, each time with a different weight. And somehow those 6 syllables covered everything I'd been unable to say to anyone for weeks. Then she said, "Tell me what you need." What I needed, it turned out, was practical and simple. I needed someone who knew the full picture to be available when I called. I needed someone to talk through the emotional tangle with, not a therapist, though Margaret had gently suggested that. And she wasn't wrong, but a person who knew Richard, who had sat at our Thanksgiving table, who could hold the contradiction of him alongside me, without needing me to resolve it. Karen did that. She drove to Columbus the following weekend and spent 2 days with me. We went through old photographs, not morbidly, but with the curiosity of 2 women, trying to identify something that had been hiding in plain sight. We found things, small things. A receipt from a Chicago restaurant dated 2009, a weekend I hadn't known he'd taken, a phone number written on the back of a business card in the desk drawer, a Chicago area code, no name, a birthday card from Patricia dated 2015 that read, "In part, Richard, you're doing the right thing. Trust me. Love P. The right thing, trust me." Karen photographed everything. Margaret received the photographs by email on Sunday evening, and replied at 10 nice p.m. with 3 words of her own. Very good. Keep looking. I also, in those weeks, returned to teaching. I had 2 sections of English composition that semester, and I had been, I'll admit it, distracted, arriving prepared but not quite present. I made a deliberate decision to be present again. I graded papers, I held office hours. I ate lunch in the faculty lounge and listened to my colleagues talk about their weekends and their students and the upcoming conference in Cincinnati. It sounds small. It wasn't small. There is something grounding about being useful in ways that have nothing to do with the thing threatening to consume you. My students didn't know anything about $33 million, or the Roth Family Trust, or Hardcastle and Ferris. They knew that their semicolons were consistently wrong, and that I'd written extensive notes in the margins of their drafts, and that I expected revision. That was enough. That was real. I drove home from campus one evening in November, and sat in the car in my driveway for a moment before going inside. The neighborhood was quiet. The trees had lost their leaves. The house, my house, looked exactly the same as it always had. I thought, I am going to win this. Not with bravado, with the calm certainty of a woman who had done her preparation, assembled her people, and was no longer afraid of what waited on the other side of a door. I went inside. I made dinner. I was ready for what came next. They came again in December. This time Patricia came alone without Doug, which I understood immediately was a strategic choice. Doug had shown his edge on the porch that October night. His implication about the money, his vaguely threatening tone. He'd been too visible, too obviously a man with something to protect. Patricia was the softer instrument, and someone Harcourt Castle and Ferris probably had decided to deploy her. She called first. She asked if she could come by. She said she'd been thinking about Richard constantly, that she was struggling, that she just wanted to sit with someone who had loved him. Her voice carried a tremor that sounded genuine, and for a moment, I want to be honest about this. I felt the pull of it. Because here is the thing about Patricia that I had to keep reminding myself. She was Richard's sister. She had loved him in her way, whatever her way was. The grief was real, even if everything else was strategic, and I had been lonely too. And Richard was gone. And there was a version of this situation in which 2 women who had both lost him could sit together and be sad. I let her come. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon, carrying a small tin of shortbread cookies, the brand Richard had liked, and I knew even then that the cookies were calculated. She set them on the kitchen counter, and I made tea, and we sat at the table where I had sat 14 months ago, reading a bank statement that had dismantled my life. For the first 20 minutes, she was just Patricia. She talked about Richard as a boy, stories I'd heard before, but loved because they were the only version of him from before I knew him. The time he'd broken their mother's ceramic rooster by accident and hidden the pieces in his closet for a year rather than confess. The way he'd always whistled while he cooked. I let myself be moved by those stories because they were true, and I let her see that I was moved because that was also true. Then she shifted. I felt it before she said anything, a small change in her posture, a setting down of her teacup. Carol, she said carefully, Richard was a complicated man. I know that's not what you want to hear right now, but he made decisions for reasons. He wasn't trying to hurt you. I know he was complicated, I said. The money. She stopped, composed herself. The way he arranged things, it was never about not trusting you. It was about protecting something that was built before the 2 of you, that was family, that he felt a responsibility toward. Before the 2 of us? I said. Patricia, we married in 1997. This account was opened in 2003. We were married, I know. But there were family considerations, things that had been understood between us for a long time before that. What was understood, I said, between you and Richard that required $33 million to be hidden from me for 20 years? She looked at me steadily. I think you know that pursuing this in court is going to be painful for everyone, for his memory, for the family he loved. I think, I said, that Richard wrote a specific addendum in 2018, stating that if I ever became aware of this trust, I should be given full access to its contents and independent legal counsel. That sounds less like a man protecting a family arrangement, and more like a man who was not entirely comfortable with that arrangement. Something moved across her face. Not quite anger, something more controlled than anger, and therefore more cold. That addendum, she said quietly, was written during a difficult period for Richard. He wasn't well that year. He was perfectly well in 2018, I said. He golfed twice a week. He taught himself to make sourdough bread. You came to visit us in August of that year, and the three of us drove to Hocking Hills. He was well. She put her hands around her teacup. Her knuckles were white. Carol. Her voice had changed. The warmth was gone. Not entirely, but enough. This is going to hurt you. The legal process, the discovery, the things that will come out about Richard's business associations. It will change how you remember him, how everyone remembers him. Is that what you want? Is that worth it to you? For money? I looked at her across the table. My mother had a phrase she used. See them clearly, not meanly clearly. Patricia, I said, I have been a good wife to your brother for 26 years. I trusted him. I believed every story he told me about our financial situation. When my mother needed surgery, I cried in a parking lot while your brother had $33 million in a private account. I'm not pursuing this for money. I'm pursuing this because what was done was wrong. And because Richard himself, whatever his reasons for the original arrangement, left me a door. She stood up. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. She was contained, perfectly, impressively contained, but I could see the effort it cost her. I hope you know what you're doing, she said. I do, I said. She left the shortbread on the counter. I closed the door behind her and stood in the hallway, and then I did something I hadn't expected. I shook, not from fear exactly, from the expenditure of having held myself that steady for that long. I sat on the stairs and pressed my back against the wall and breathed. But as the shaking passed, something else came in behind it, something clean and hard and warm all at once. I was not going to back down, and Patricia Hayes had just confirmed by her desperation that she already knew it. The hearing was scheduled for February, but it wasn't a trial. It was a discovery hearing in Cook County Probate Court, convened to review the full financial history of the Raw Family Trust and determine the applicable rights of all interested parties. Margaret had described it to me as the moment the other side has to stop being vague. She was right. I dressed carefully that morning. A dark navy suit I'd bought for Richard's memorial service and hadn't worn since. Sensible heels. No jewelry except my wedding ring, which I was still wearing. Not for sentiment, or not only for sentiment, but because in a hearing about what I was owed as Richard's wife, it seemed precisely relevant. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. A probate hearing room rather than a grand courtroom, but it had the weight of the law in it. The formality that made everyone sit slightly straighter. Patricia and Doug sat on the other side of the room, with two attorneys from Hardcastle and Ferris. Patricia wore black. Doug wore a suit that was slightly too expensive for the occasion, the way Doug always was. They didn't look at me when I came in. Margaret had obtained, through the discoveries process, 3 years of financial records from the trust. What those records contained had been shared with me the week before the hearing, and I had read through them twice at my kitchen table, with a highlighter and a legal pad, making notes in the margins the way I marked my students' essays. Carefully, looking for the underlying structure of the argument. The underlying structure, it turned out, was damning. The trust had been funded primarily through a series of investments Richard had made, beginning in 2001, using capital that was, beyond any legal ambiguity, marital property. Money deposited into our joint account from his salary, the salary I believed was modest, had been systematically diverted into a separate account maintained under a business entity called Raw Logistics Consulting, LLC, before being transferred quarterly into the trust. For 20 years, Richard had been paying himself a real salary from the company's operations and reporting only a portion of it to our joint household. The rest, accumulating over 2 decades with investment returns, had become $33 million. Margaret presented this to the court with the specific calm of someone who has done an enormous amount of work and knows it. Then Hardcastle and Ferris's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Leonard Cade, argued that the trust's assets were entirely Richard's separate business proceeds and not subject to spousal claims. He was precise. He was confident. And then Margaret asked the court to admit Exhibit 14, bank transfer records, showing that the initial capitalization of Raw Logistics Consulting, LLC, in 2001 had come from a $40,000 withdrawal from our joint checking account. A withdrawal I had no memory of authorizing because I'd been in Pittsburgh that week attending my father's retirement party. I had receipts. The room changed when that exhibit went in, not dramatically. Courts don't work dramatically, but I saw Leonard Cade pause before he continued speaking, and I saw Doug Hayes lean toward Patricia and say something in a rapid, low voice. And I saw Patricia press her lips together in a way I had never seen her do before. The expression of someone watching something they cannot stop. The judge, a compact, precise woman in her 60s, named the Honorable Denise Fogarty, asked Katie directly whether the trust's funding documentation could confirm the source of the initial capitalization. Cade said he would need to review the specific transfer. Mr. Cade, Judge Fogarty said, with the patience of a woman who had seen this particular delay tactic many times, the transfer is dated June 14, 2001. It originated from a joint checking account held by Richard and Carol Whitmore. We have the bank record. I'd like your client's response. There was a pause. Across the room, Doug Hayes was very still. Leonard Cade said, "The trust's position is that Mr. Whitmore had authority over joint funds and used that authority in a manner consistent with his role as primary earner in the household." "Mrs. Whitmore," said Judge Fogarty, turning to our table, "was this withdrawal discussed with you?" Margaret stood. "Your Honor. Mrs. Whitmore has a sworn affidavit confirming she was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, during the week of that withdrawal. She also has documentation showing she was unaware of Raw Logistics Consulting LLC until these proceedings." I sat at that table and I held myself very still. I did not look at Patricia. I did not look at Doug. I looked at Judge Fogarty and I let the facts do their work. The unraveling when it came was not theatrical. It was methodical. Over the next 2 hours, Katie's position shifted by degrees from confident assertion to careful qualification to something that sounded increasingly like retreat. Margaret pressed each concession: the trust's initial funding, marital assets, the ongoing transfers, documented, systematic, concealed from the marital estate. The 2018 addendum, Richard's own acknowledgement that Carol had a right to know. At one point, Patricia was asked directly by the judge's clerk to confirm her understanding at the time of the trust's creation that it was funded by marital assets. Her attorney, objected. The judge sustained the objection, but the question had been asked, and it sat in the room. Doug Hayes looked for the first time in our long acquaintance genuinely uncertain. The practiced confidence was gone. He kept his eyes on the table in front of him, and he did not look up when Margaret concluded her presentation, and he did not look up when the judge said she would render a preliminary ruling within 15 days. When we stood to leave, Patricia finally looked at me. Just for a moment. Her face was composed. She was always composed, I'll give her that. But her eyes were a particular kind of empty that I recognized. It was the look of a person who has been holding something for a very long time and has just felt it begin to slip. I nodded to her the way you nod to someone you have nothing more to say to. Margaret and I walked out into the February cold of North Michigan Avenue. The lake was gray and enormous at the end of the street. "She'll rule in our favor," Margaret said quietly. I believed her. Judge Fogarty's preliminary ruling came on a Thursday morning, 12 days after the hearing. Margaret called me at 8:47 a.m. I was in my office at the community college between classes grading a stack of second drafts on Zora Neale Hurston. "Carol," Margaret said, "we won." I put down my red pen. The ruling was thorough, 23 pages which Margaret walked me through that afternoon in her Columbus office. Judge Fogarty had found that the initial capitalization of the Raw Family Trust, having originated from marital joint funds, without the documented knowledge or consent of Carol Whitmore, constituted a misappropriation of marital assets. The ongoing diversion of income into the trust via Raw Logistics Consulting LLC compounded this finding. while Richard had legal authority to make many financial decisions independently during the marriage. The scope and systematic concealment of these transfers crossed into a violation of fiduciary duties within the marital relationship. The trust, as structured, could not legally exclude me. Under Illinois law and applicable Ohio spousal rights provisions, my elective share of the marital estate, which the court had now properly valued at the full trust balance plus accrued investment returns, amounted to $16.9 million. $16.9 million. I sat in Margaret's office and let that number exist in the room. Leonard Cade filed an objection within 48 hours, and Margaret told me this was expected, procedural, and unlikely to succeed given the quality of the evidentiary record. She was right. The objection was denied within 3 weeks. What happened next unfolded over the following 4 months, with the grinding, comprehensive thoroughness of the legal system working as it was designed to work. Hardcastle and Ferris offered a settlement, $11 million. Margaret declined. They offered $13 million. Margaret declined. They offered $15 million, and a stipulation that Patricia and Doug would retain the remainder of the trust without further dispute. Margaret called me. Carol, $15 million is a meaningful number. The remaining litigation will take months, possibly a year, and there's always risk in any legal proceeding. Margaret, I said, what does the ruling say we're entitled to? 16.9. Then I want 16.9. There was a brief pause. I could hear her smiling. All right, she said. We decline. Final settlement, negotiated not from a position of compromise, but from a position of documented legal entitlement, was reached in June. 16 Zider $85 million to an account in my name with an additional $50,000 in legal fee reimbursements. Patricia and Doug retained the remaining $16 million in the trust plus accrued, returns less substantial legal fees of their own. Close to $800,000 by the end, Margaret estimated, given the length and complexity of the proceedings. The day the transfer cleared, I was in my backyard in Columbus. It was a warm June morning. I had coffee. I had my neighbor Donna's tabby cat, who had wandered over as she did sometimes, and was sitting on the porch railing with the particular authority of cats. I looked at the number on my phone's banking app for a long time. Then I called Karen. It's done, I said. She cried. I didn't. Not then. Not at that moment. That would come later, alone in the quiet of the house. The good cry that had been waiting a long time. But in that moment, I was simply steady, looking at my backyard in the June morning. The grass I'd been meaning to reseed along the fence line. The oak tree Richard had planted the first year we'd moved in, which was now taller than the house. Margaret had one final conversation with me before we formally closed out the engagement. She sat across from me in her clean office and took her glasses off and set them down. You should know, she said, that in 22 years of estate litigation, I've had very few clients who held up the way you did. The offer at $750,000 would have broken most people. The visit from Patricia would have broken most people. You didn't flinch. I flinched. I said. I just did it in private. She smiled. That's the same thing. One more thing happened before I consider the chapter truly closed, and I want to include it because it mattered to me more than the money. 2 weeks after the settlement, I drove back to First Meridian Private Bank in Chicago. I had called ahead and asked to meet with Gerald Bloom. He received me in the same conference room, the same table, the same water glass. I placed the copy of Richard's 2018 handwritten addendum on the table between us. I believe she will know what to do. He came here in 2018 to add this, I asked. He did, Gerald Bloom said. He came alone. He was very quiet. He didn't explain his reasons. Did he seem? I stopped. What word was I looking for? Guilty? Remorseful? Afraid? Did he seem like a man who had made peace with something? Gerald Bloom considered that for a moment. He was a careful man, a lifetime of care in that face. He seemed, he said slowly, like a man who wanted to leave something right. I thanked him. I drove back to Columbus. I sat in the oak tree's shade in my backyard, and I let my husband be complicated, and I let myself be the woman who had survived it. It's strange the way a life restructures itself around a new truth. You think the money will change everything at once. It doesn't. It changes slowly in layers. not with a single dramatic announcement, but with 100 small shifts you only recognize looking back. The first thing I did was the washing machine. Not because I needed to. The old one still worked, but because I wanted to stand in a Home Depot and choose the best one without looking at the price tag first. I stood in the laundry room afterward and felt something I had no word for, not triumph. The relief of a restraint finally released. I worked with a financial advisor to build a structure for the money that would serve me long term. A trust of my own, investments. A small, charitable foundation covering medical costs for families who couldn't afford necessary surgery. Renamed for my mother, whose hip replacement had sent me crying to a hospital parking lot, while $33 million sat in Chicago. I traveled. Portugal with Karen, Lisbon. Bread. I'll never stop thinking about miles walked before the heat came. Scotland alone in November, which I'd been afraid to do and turned out to be something I was very good at. I kept teaching. I developed a writing workshop for adult learners returning after significant life breaks. Divorce, illness, loss. 9 students the first semester. 3 of them stayed an hour after the final class just to keep talking. That course still fills every semester. As for Patricia and Doug Dutton, the legal fees, nearly $900,000 by final accounting, had cracked something in their Scottsdale life. The house with the pool was sold. Doug's business brought in a partner under unfavorable terms. Patricia moved to Phoenix. I felt no satisfaction in this. I felt distance, the clean-earned distance of a woman who had closed a chapter properly. Richard, I thought about often. The man with the secret and the man who'd left me a door existed alongside the man who'd brought me coffee on Saturday mornings. Merry marriage is a living record, and mine contained more deception and more love than I had known. The oak tree he planted our first year is very tall now. I had a bench placed beneath it. Some mornings I sit there, and I think the woman who found that envelope did all right.